my sense of where the differences are is not so much sort of in terms of the direction, but rather the speed of the transition. How quickly are countries willing to make their transition? How quickly are countries able to make their transition?
Welcome back, everybody. Richard Baker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, government representatives about their work that they're doing to identify, understand, and deploy their solutions against the challenge that we're facing. In this episode, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Mattias Frumerie, who is Sweden's climate ambassador and head of delegation to UNFCCC at the Swedish Ministry of Climate and Enterprise. And through my conversation with Mattias today, I'm really excited to learn about the work that he and his team are doing over there, to understand more about not just the work they do at COP or through Climate Week or other multilateral platforms, but really on the daily operations, like what are they doing to understand and develop frameworks for policy, finance, innovation, and business opportunities so that we can start to make real progress against these goals. And so with that, Mattias, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's really great to have you here to talk a little about the work that you're doing, some of the things you're seeing, and the activities that you and your team are engaged with.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be with you.
So as a starting point, an introduction to yourself, a little about the work that you're doing and how you came into the work.
I've had a sort of traditionally foreign office career, I guess you could say, throughout the years. And I was working on climate and sustainability in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for maybe 1.5 years. A great opportunity. And really, I think the sort of from a professional perspective, what really is intriguing here and so fascinating is sort of to work with these multiple layers of governance and how they link together. We have sort of course, building on our experience as a country, what we are doing to accelerate our path to net zero, and how we work within the EU, both sort of what the EU itself is doing, but also how the EU projects itself to the wider world. And then, of course, how that links together into sort of the wider, both the UNFCCC context itself, but also increasingly where we're seeing how climate action is being integrated throughout other types of bodies and in everything from the G20 to the multilateral development banks, the G7 and other types of fora as well. And of course, also purely bilaterally between Sweden and other countries. So sort of, again, from a professional perspective, bringing all of these various dimensions together itself is something which I find, which makes the job part of the appeal of the job.
So what is the job? What is the role of a climate ambassador? What are you doing on a daily basis, or what is your main responsibilities?
This comes down to some kind of coordination and striving for impact globally, especially within the head of delegation role. I mean, obviously, sort of being there to support the team. We have 25 colleagues within the Swedish delegation to the actual COP meetings, but also as part of our regular work. We negotiate on behalf of the EU or within the context of the EU within the negotiation. So it's not sort of Sweden sitting at the table, but the European Union as such. So last year, for example, when Sweden was held the presidency of the EU, it was me and my colleagues who were in many cases representing the EU in those various types of conversations. But then, of course, also coordinating within our administration and to ensure as far as possible that we are sort of working in a joined up approach in terms of our relations to our partner countries. So making sure that sort of whatever bits and pieces that we're doing throughout our various types of agencies across government and together, not least with Swedish business actors as well, that is having sort of the desired impact in terms of how we can be supporting our partner countries into accelerating their transition.
The EU itself, many members experiencing different challenges. How aligned are you as a team on these topics, and how much do you find yourself kind of having to put forward a Swedish-oriented agenda, or how much is aligned and how much is kind of up for negotiation on any given conversation or within the big conversations?
As we are in Sweden building on our national experience in terms of the kind of approach that we would encourage other countries to take. Also, we're building on what we've achieved within the EU in terms of our approach in relation to other countries. Then, of course, as you're saying, there are different experiences across member states. Just looking at the kind of energy mix that countries have, we were lucky, and maybe not only luck, but also some forward planning when it comes to our energy mix from a Swedish perspective, whereas other member states might have sort of a longer way to go in terms of achieving that kind of fossil-free energy mix, which of course also puts us in different positions when it comes to the lines we want to take and the kind of arguments we want to use in relation to third countries. But my sense, though, is that we have a strong message when it comes to us as the EU.
Well, I'll say in Asia, the EU's voice is very strong here in terms of setting the regulations, setting the tones, like a lot of regulations coming out. And it seems like the team is really working well together, even though you may have some differences here and there, but there seems to be a real common kind of momentum that's happening. And what's behind that?
It comes back to also what the two key messages that we are basing our work from a Swedish perspective on, and that's urgency and opportunity. So urgency based on the science, we know we need to do this, but also looking to the opportunities that we see in the transition and what it brings in terms of new jobs and growth. And especially during the Swedish presidency last year, we made sure to bring forward the sort of the competitiveness angle of the transition. When we talk to Swedish business actors, is very much about, because they see that this is how they will secure their competitiveness going forward. They're transforming their business models because they see that that's how they will be both surviving and also making their company stronger. And I think, and also another aspect there, with for the past couple of years, how we've seen the civil society movement and the youth movement in particular, putting forward their expectations in terms of what the legislators should be doing, but also in terms of expectations on business. All those factors taken together, I think, has contributed to the kind of momentum we're seeing within Europe, and also how we're hoping to build momentum in countries globally.
When it comes to urgency, what's the size and scope that you're seeing these days? Because here in Asia, and as I've been talking with some people in Africa, we're already at 2 to 3 degrees, well past. How are you planning well beyond 1.5, which was the goal in Paris? Do you now adjust a little bit to say, well, we might be at 2.8, 3.2, or do you try and really focus on 1.5 and keeping everyone focused on that for now, and then aligning actions, regulations, and maybe intentions around that?
I mean, you will have seen in sort of all decisions coming out of COPs for the past couple of years that it is indeed 1.5. Keeping 1.5 as was the mantra at COP26, not least. But also when we did the global stocktake last year, which concluded then in Dubai at COP28. I mean, it was indeed making sure that all the new NDCs are 1.5 aligned. It is up to all the parties, all countries, to decide in their nationally determined manner what is it that we can do to contribute to keeping 1.5 alive. And of course, I mean, that's also a conversation we're having sort of within the EU, since we have a joint NDC, but also, again, in relation to our partner countries. So that's obviously a conversation which we're intensifying now in the next couple of months to ensure that we, as a global community, are responding to the calls within the GST to keep 1.5 alive in the new NDCs.
So when you say keep the intensity, is it kind of like 15 years ago where people are like, it's not a problem, it's too far away? Or is the intensity like, look, we're coming to the red lines. We've already surpassed some red lines. And now actually there's more momentum to find agreement, to actually find transition and to fund those transitions.
My sense of where the differences are today is not so much sort of in terms of the direction, but rather the speed of the transition. And how quickly are countries willing to make their transition, and how quickly are countries able to make their transition as well. At least from a Swedish perspective, we're trying to put forward the kind of solutions that we see are available. And again, when we speak to the Swedish business actors, at least, they say there are solutions available across the economy, and that's the kind of the spirit and the approach which we want to bring to the global conversation as well. That there are solutions available, and if they're not available now, they will be available in this next NDC cycle, up to 2035.
I mean, there's a lot of obstacles. What are a couple of them that you think are still remaining, and what are a couple that you think over the last few years have a lot of progress has been made at the NDC level or through the conversations that you've been seeing?
Let me start by just sort of looking to the 3 elements which we normally put forward as part of our Swedish climate diplomacy. First, on the policy side, making sure that you have a regulatory environment domestically which implements the Paris Agreement as ambitiously as possible. We're sharing then, the kind of experience we have with our climate policy framework. We set ourselves our 2045 net zero target, and of course, how you sort of what kind of regulatory framework you put in place to incentivize the transition. And then secondly, on finance, there's a couple of elements in there as well. I mean, what we would advocate is for all countries to integrate climate action throughout your national budget and planning processes. And of course that can be done in multiple various ways, and making sure then, of course, that you're not spending government money or public funding on fossil fuels, for example. And if you're doing that, what kind of transition plan do you have away from fossil fuels? Secondly, I'd look at for us as a large donor, making sure that we're, again, sort of not contributing to any kind of fossil fuel activities, but equally also having that kind of dialogue with our developing country partners and encouraging them to integrate climate action across the kind of priorities they put forward to us in their dialogue with us as donors. And thirdly, which is maybe more importantly when it comes to finance, ensuring that you have an investment climate which attracts the kind of investment necessary, both domestic and international. And then, of course, that comes back to, again, the regulatory approach is set. What kind of incentives do you have? What kind of steer do you give? For example, your pension funds, your banks, your financial actors more generally. For example, when I talk to Swedish banks, some of them saying to their corporate customers, we will not be providing you credit unless you can prove that your business is Paris aligned. And of course, that's a very strong signal from big commercial banks to their corporate clients. So that's an important element also when it comes to finance. And then finally, then on technology, basically that's sort of the kind of technological solutions then that, in our case, Swedish business actors can offer to accelerate the transition. And by bringing those three together, we hope to be able to create that kind of, some kind of positive loop, putting in place more ambitious policies, which will create demand then for new kinds of solutions. And once you have those kind of solutions in place, you can also, again, raise the bar in terms of your regulatory approach, which will spur, further demand for new types of solutions. And of course, having the financial solutions in between there as well to support that kind of development.
Sitting here thinking about how much of that reaches into my world in Asia. I've been in Singapore, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Ho Chi Minh. I live in China, and I would say policy-wise, all of them are reaching in with different levels of awareness. Finance, certainly in Southeast Asia, a lot of people talking about that. And Sweden is a big donor in that area, but also big, through the banks and the multilaterals, doing quite a bit of work there. And then technology, obviously, I work with a lot of firms who are coming into the space, trying to deliver their solutions. So you have a lot going on there. I'm curious, how much, when you're thinking through this, do you think about how to take your needs, and as you're developing your policy, your financial and your technology kind of frameworks, how much do you think about the other nations? How much do you have to consider about how they would be able to integrate, uptake, adapt, iterate using your examples?
This kind of approach has to be tailored to each particular country. Where is this country in terms of their regulatory approach? What needs to be done first? What have they put in place? And of course, when it comes to finance as well, what are the needs? How can we as a country be supporting? What can the EU be doing? What are the various types of financing which can be provided? And what we're saying basically to our embassies is look at which are the greatest needs for that particular country, whether it comes to emission sectors, which are the highest emitting sectors, or maybe they're more sort of on the adaptation side, that a country where it needs to be strengthening their resilience to whatever kind of impacts they're already seeing, and then sort of try to match that with the kind of Swedish solutions that are available. So in the best case scenario, that is how we can be being sort of more granular on a national level to be supporting and engaging with that particular country.
When it comes to, say, the platforms that you're using or the platforms that you are engaging with, what are the roles of, say, COP, Climate Week, and other global platforms? What's your balance, and what do you find to be the most effective when it comes to creating actionable dialogue versus, say, longer term, framework to policy to action over, say, a decade?
There's so many layers to that, but just I guess one way of framing that would be that within the negotiation process, what we're trying to set is some kind of sort of global regulatory, not always regulatory, but sort of global approach to how do we move forward on that particular issue. For example, we've seen for the past couple of years an expansion of what we within the UNFCCC process called work programs, which are designed in a way sort of to compare notes and put forward best practice to accelerate their implementation of the Paris Agreement. So the more that we can use those kind of platforms to showcase the kind of examples, our hope would be that there would be an uptake and a conversation on, what are these good examples and how can we be supporting each other in the global process to bring back home and implement domestically. So but in a way, of course, that is also, can be perceived as indirect. You're not sort of seeing that particular action then being taken. It's more sort of an arena to share these kind of best practice. In a sense, if you want to see, I would think, more direct impact, of course, that is when you go more granular on a country level, or maybe even on a sort of regional, local level. The results that we're kind of seeing is, what kind of projects are actually being implemented. Is there a new wind farm? Is there, energy access being accelerated in a particular country? That's another type of indicators which we're of course trying to look to in terms of the kind of impact that we can have.
When you really get granular on, say, a specific topic, I think it's much easier to find some traction, align interests of stakeholders, and even like within policy, which I think is more collaborative, it gets clearer, with fewer actors in the room. So I'm curious, like, how do you view a COP or a climate week where you really have hundreds of thousands of people involved at different times? Like, what's the value or the function of those platforms at this point? It seems like they're like negotiating to a single goal tends to like really stop or slow down a lot of momentum that directly you could be making on very siloed or nuanced issues.
It's not sort of about the size or the numbers, but rather how impactful are these types of events in terms of raising the level of awareness, again, coming back to the possibility to highlight the solutions that we have available. We, from a Swedish perspective, we're members of some 80 of these various, international climate initiatives. One, for example, which we're co-chairing together with India, called the Leadership Group on Industry Transition, which was launched already in 2019, and now brings together some 40 actors and going deep dive in terms of specifically how you're transforming or transitioning, within the steel and cement sectors. What kind of policy levers can we put in place? What kind of incentives can we put in place? And what kind of technology is available to make that kind of transition? So increasingly, we're seeing how these platforms also are very much complementing the negotiations track. That's also, I would think, useful, because it again sort of points to the increasing number of actors who are engaging and are putting forward solutions and are wanting to be part of this, which I think helps us also in the approach that we want to take in highlighting the opportunities in the transition.
I mean, I would argue right now consensus is there that we need to take action. What are some of the things that allow us to think that we're actually the flywheel's picking up speed and we're making more progress now?
And again, my sense is that all countries are aware of what we need to do in terms of the transition. The question is how quickly you're willing to make that transition, and how does that impact your economy, and how what kind of new ways, new inflows to your economy can you secure. So of course, I would think that in many ways the question that fossil fuel exporters need to ask themselves and are asking themselves, how do we transition our economy from being dependent on income from fossil fuel exports to securing new types of income so we can sustain our economy. And and I would argue it's in our interest from a Swedish and EU perspective to be part of that journey and to work with our partners to whatever we can do to help them in that kind of transition. And again, coming back to the kind of solutions that we see are available in terms of new incomes which can be secured.
A lot of talks about we're going to overshoot, we need to move to mitigation, move to adaptation. How does that come into your work? And are you trying to fight that off and just keep people on 1.5 for now? Or are you having to find that you need to start bringing in some of those conversations, say, well, what if? Like, how does that fit into the frameworks that you're developing or into your own mindsets and the work that you're doing?
Increasingly seen that adaptation efforts are part of what we're doing. When the Swedish government just a couple of months ago delivered its, I think, second adaptation strategy for our domestic work when it comes to adaptation. There's the EU adaptation strategy. So obviously, yes, we are working even more on that, both on a domestic and on the EU level. One thing to add there as well on adaptation, I would hope that we in that conversation on adaptation would also increasingly be talking about not adaptation sort of as a standalone issue, but rather how do you integrate your resilience efforts into, again, all sectors of the economy. And when you're talking about healthcare, for example, when you're building hospitals, how do you ensure that those hospitals have heating and cooling systems to provide for changing temperatures? How do you ensure that health staff are versed in whatever kind of new kind of diseases that are going to develop as a result of a changing climate and increasing temperatures? How do you ensure that whatever kind of roads and ports that you're building are resilient towards heat and impacts that you're seeing? Making sure that you're integrating that within any kind of decision making, I think is really the key element of adaptation.
How do you manage all of these conversations and all these topics? How do you prioritize these? What's the team that you've built, and how do you measure your progress?
It comes back to this coordination role and trying to both support as the team, the negotiations team, making sure that we're setting the right kind of priorities there, and then sort of more on the on the country engagement side, trying also to contribute to whatever kind of structures we have to be as efficient as possible in reaching out to our partners and what we can provide as a country. What can we do in terms of policy? What kind of agencies do we bring in? Kind of colleagues at the Swedish Energy Agency, at our Environmental Protection Agency, who have that kind of experience from working in Sweden in terms of how we set up our policy environment. What kind of financial actors do we bring in? Can we engage with Swedish pension funds, insurers, and for them to engage also with partner countries, and then of course the technological part of it.
Just personally, what do you think are some of the key skills or mindsets, tool sets that you brought through your previous work in diplomacy, or you currently have, that give you the best chance for success in the work that you're trying to do?
Being a good listener is always good in negotiations. Being aware of what is it that others want, but of course also being very much aware of what is it that you yourself need and want, and how do you match that, and how to reach consensus within the negotiations.
And what about, say, science and technology backgrounds? Is it important for you to really have a scientific grasp of all the jargon around, say, climate change, or the systems that are involved, and the different actors, technologies, or is it being the convening power that's more important?
Obviously, it's helpful for me personally to have a grasp of both in terms of the science and the technology. But I don't see that as my role as being that sort of expert. When I need to, I can rely on those experts and bring them into the conversation as well.
What's the role of passion in your role? How does that show through in your work?
Personally, I must say that this is it's an incredibly rewarding job, and I'm privileged to have this opportunity to be working with this great team and working based on the kind of story that we can tell, which makes me proud every day, really, to be able to put forward the kind of messages that we can put forward in terms of what we're seeing, the kind of engagement from across society. It is really indeed a privilege to be able to have that kind of opportunity.
One more question, which would be, assuming that we have some young professionals or some students who've been watching this, they see government as the medium for change. They want to be part of the climate negotiations. They want to become climate ambassador. What are 2 or 3 pieces of advice you'd give them to get along a little bit further in their own path?
Being curious in terms of how can you learn from your present role, and how to be able to contribute from that curiosity as much as you can. What kind of solutions can you bring to the table, and within the present role that you have, and being part of that.